Small thing. Brown leather, water-stained on one corner from the time I dropped it in the Picos crossing back in '68. Every evening, before I eat, before I roll my tobacco, before I do anything a man does when the sky turns copper and the wind dies, I sit on whatever flat surface presents itself. I uncap my pencil, and I write the day down in numbers. Miles covered, weight hauled, money owed, money earned, temperature if I can guess it, the number of times my left mule, Roscoe, tried to bite my right mule, Alina. That last one's not useful to anyone, I just find it grounding. Roscoe bit Alina 4 times today, I'll write, and somehow the world feels less like it's spinning off its axle. April 14th, that was the day. I remember because I wrote the date twice, once in the ledger, and once in my head, where it carved itself into some permanent place I didn't give it permission to occupy. I've been running salt from the depot at Carrizo Springs up toward Fort Davis. Long haul, empty country. The kind of land where the horizon doesn't come to you, you go to it and it moves. I'd done this route 9 times. Could practically close my eyes and let Roscoe and Alina find their way, though Alina would veer left if she smelled creosote bush, and Roscoe would stop dead if a jackrabbit crossed within 40 feet, so closing my eyes was more ambition than practice. That evening I'd pulled off the main trail about 2 miles east, near a cluster of cottonwoods fed by a seep spring that wasn't on any map but had never once been dry when I needed it. Good spot. Sheltered. Quiet in the way that only places forgotten by people can be quiet, not silent, but layered. Crickets whined through dry grass, the occasional soft thud of a cottonwood root drinking. I unhitched the mules, fed them, built a fire small enough to heat coffee and large enough to keep the temperature honest. I sat on the dropped tailgate of the wagon, opened my ledger, and began to write. 14 miles, 600 pounds of salt, $2 credit remaining at Delgado's supply post. Roscoe bit Alina 3 times, temperature cool for April, wind from the southwest. That's when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, a shift. The grain sacks in the wagon bed redistributing their weight in a way that grain sacks don't do on their own. Grain settles. It doesn't resettle. I know this because I've hauled enough of it to understand its physics the way a mother understands her child's breathing, not through education, but through repetition so deep it becomes instinct. I set down my pencil. I didn't reach for my rifle. I want to be clear about that because later when people asked me to recount this, they always assumed I reached for the rifle first. I didn't. I reached for the lantern. Because whatever was in my wagon, I wanted to see it before I decided what to do about it. And a man who draws on what he can't see is either brave or stupid, and I have never had the luxury of being either. I lifted the lantern over the tailgate and pushed it toward the center of the wagon bed. Between the salt barrels and the 2 remaining grain sacks, I was delivering to a ranch outside Fort Davis. 2 eyes. That's all I saw at first. 2 eyes wide, catching the lantern light like creek water catches noon sun, not reflecting it, but holding it, trembling with it. The rest of her was invisible, buried. Pressed so flat between the grain sacks that she'd made herself into something barely human-shaped. The way a rabbit will flatten itself into the earth when it knows the hawk is already diving. I held the lantern steady. My hand was not steady, I'll admit that. Easy, I said. I don't know why that was the first word I chose. I say it to Roscoe when he's working himself into a bite. I say it to Alina when she shies at shadows. I'd never said it to a person before. But it came out the way it comes out with the mules, low, slow, without expectation. She didn't move, didn't blink. The trembling didn't stop. It might have worsened, though measuring another person's fear against a baseline you don't have is guesswork at best. I set the lantern on the wagon rail and stepped back. 2 full steps, gave her the space and the choice. If she wanted to run, she could run. If she wanted to stay hidden, she could stay hidden. My only job in that moment was to not be the thing she was afraid of, and I didn't know yet whether I was or wasn't, so distance seemed like the only honest offering. I went back to the fire, poured coffee, sat down. I picked up my ledger again, but I didn't write. I just held the pencil because holding something helps when your hands want to shake, and you'd rather they didn't. Minutes passed. I counted them by sips of coffee. 4 sips. 5. On the 6th, I heard the grain sacks shift again, and when I looked up carefully, the way you look at something you don't want to frighten, she was sitting upright in the wagon bed, watching me. She was young, not a child, but not far from one, that territory between girlhood and womanhood where the body has decided but the eyes haven't caught up. Her hair was dark and loose, tangled with bits of grain husk. Her dress, if you could call it that, was torn along one shoulder, and the tear wasn't the kind made by a branch or a nail. It was the kind made by a hand. I've mended enough canvas to know the difference between a rip and a grab. She was Apache. I knew this the way you know anything on this land if you've been on it long enough, not from one detail, but from 20. The way she sat. The particular darkness of her eyes, not just in color but in depth, as if they'd been taught to take in everything and give back nothing. The bone structure. The small beaded pouch she clutched against her chest with both hands, knuckles pale against dark skin. And I knew, in the same quiet way, I knew Roscoe's moods and Alina's fears, that whatever had put her in my wagon was worse than whatever I represented. Because an Apache girl does not hide among a white man's grain sacks unless every other option has already burned down. "There's coffee," I said, didn't point at it, didn't gesture, just said it the way I'd say it to the wind. "It's not good coffee, but it's hot." She didn't answer. I didn't expect her to. I went back to my ledger. I wrote one passenger, unplanned. It was the most important entry I'd ever made, and it was the least precise. But what else do you write when the whole careful arithmetic of your life suddenly includes a variable you can't quantify? She climbed out of the wagon sometime later. I don't know exactly when because I'd made a point of not watching. I heard her feet on the ground, bare feet, which I noted because the ground out here will punish bare feet in ways that boots barely survive. I heard her move to the far side of the fire, keeping the flames between us. Smart. The fire was a wall, a negotiation. She could see me through it, and I could see her through it. But neither of us could reach the other without the crossing being visible, deliberate, and slow. She sat on the ground, drew her knees up, kept the beaded pouch against her chest. I poured coffee into my second tin cup, the one I kept for occasions that never came, and set it on a flat rock near the fire's edge on her side. Then I sat back down on mine. She looked at the cup for a long time, then at me, then back at the cup. She reached for it the way you reach into a river when you don't know how cold it is, fast, committed, braced for pain. She took it and pulled it back to her chest, holding it with the same intensity she held the pouch, as if warmth and whatever was in that pouch were the only two things in the world she trusted. I wrote in my ledger, cup accepted, no words exchanged. I know how that sounds, cold, clinical, like I was cataloging her the way I'd catalog a delivery. But you have to understand the ledger wasn't for her, it was for me. It was my way of processing a moment I had no framework for. I didn't know what to do, so I did what I always did. I wrote things down. And in writing them down, I gave myself permission to not know what came next, because the ledger only asks for what's already happened. It doesn't demand a plan. The fire burned, the mules shuffled. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, an owl called out, not the aggressive hoot of a territorial male, but the soft, questioning trill of a female looking for response. No response came. The owl asked again, nothing. The girl drank the coffee in small sips. When she finished, she set the cup down on the rock where she'd found it, precise, intentional. She put it back exactly where it had been, as if returning a borrowed thing to its proper place mattered, even now, even here, even in whatever storm was raging inside her. That's when I knew something about her character that no words could have told me. She had manners, not the performative kind that people put on when they want something. The deep kind. The kind that survive terror. The kind that are so woven into a person's identity that even when the whole self is shaking apart, the small courtesies hold. I didn't ask her name. I didn't ask where she came from. I didn't ask what happened. Every instinct in me wanted to, and I sat on every one of them the way you sit on a horse that's trying to bolt, not comfortably, but completely. Because here's what I understood even then, even with my limited capacity for understanding anything beyond salt weights and mule psychology. Questions are a luxury of safety. You ask questions when the ground is stable. When a person is standing on nothing, you don't ask them to explain how they got there. You just hold still and let them find their footing. I slept that night in my usual spot, on the ground beside the wagon's front wheel, my bedroll spread over a patch of sand I'd cleared of stones. I left her the wagon bed. Didn't offer it, just didn't claim it. The distinction mattered, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. I woke once in the night, 2 a.m. maybe. The fire had dropped to embers, and the air had that cold clarity that desert nights produce, not biting but honest, the kind of cold that doesn't pretend. I could see her shape in the wagon bed, curled between the grain sacks again, though differently now. Before, she'd been compressed, hiding. Now she was merely small, the difference between a person making themselves invisible and a person simply sleeping in the only position that feels safe. I wrote nothing in the ledger. Some moments resist documentation. Morning came the way it does in that country, not gradually but decisively, as if the sun had places to be and saw no reason to be theatrical about its arrival. I built the fire back up, made coffee, heated a tin of beans that I'd been saving for Fort Davis, but which suddenly seemed less important than it had the day before. She was awake before I was done. I know this because when I turned around with the beans, she was sitting upright in the wagon, watching me with that same unblinking attention, and there was no grogginess in it, no transition from sleep to wakefulness. She'd simply been asleep and then she wasn't, the way animals wake, fully, instantly, without the clumsy negotiation that humans usually require. I set the tin of beans on the same flat rock, beside it a spoon, beside the spoon the coffee cup refilled. Then I walked away, went to check on the mules, took longer than I needed to. Adjusted Alina's harness twice, which she tolerated with the weary patience of a creature who has long since accepted that her human does unnecessary things when he's nervous. When I came back, the beans were half gone, and the spoon was on the rock. She was standing, first time I'd seen her upright. She was shorter than I'd guessed, barely 5 feet, but she stood the way certain people stand, with a stillness that has nothing to do with height and everything to do with presence. The torn shoulder of her dress had been gathered and tucked, repaired with a strip of cloth I didn't recognize. She'd fixed it herself sometime in the night with materials she'd found or carried. Again, that deep structural dignity, that refusal to be reduced by circumstance. She looked at me, and for the first time her expression shifted from fear to something else. Not trust, not yet, something before trust, something that has no name in English and probably has no name in her language either, because it's too fragile and too new to survive being named. The look a deer gives you when it has decided to stop running but hasn't yet decided to stay. I'm headed to Fort Davis, I said. Another 2 days, maybe 3 the way Alina walks. I don't know if she understood English. Her face gave me nothing, but she looked at the wagon, at the space between the grain sacks, and then back at me. I nodded, didn't say anything else, just hitched the mules and climbed onto the driver's bench. When we pulled out, I heard her settle into the wagon bed behind me. Not hiding this time, just writing. The grain sacks shifted as she found her position, and then they were still. I opened my ledger on my knee, holding the reins with one hand, and wrote April 15th. 2 passengers now, 1 unplanned, route unchanged. Roscoe bit a leaner once before departure. Temperature warming, wind from the south. And below that, in smaller letters, so small I could barely read them myself. She stayed. The trail between my Seep Spring camp and Fort Davis passes through a stretch of land that has no name on the official maps, but which the freighters who work this route call the burn. Not because it burned, though it might have once decades back, but because crossing it feels like burning. Flat, exposed, no shade for 12 miles. The sun doesn't hit you there. It leans on you the way a man leans on a fence post, casually, totally, with all his weight. We entered the burn around mid-morning. I pulled my hat low and let the mules set their own pace, which was slower than I wanted but probably wiser. Roscoe, for all his temper, has an understanding of heat that I'll never match. He knows when to push and when to conserve, and he does not care about my schedule. I heard her shift behind me, not uncomfortable, curious. She was looking out over the burn, taking in the emptiness with an expression I couldn't fully see from the bench but could partially read in the angle of her head, the way she held herself slightly forward, scanning. She knew this land, that was clear. Not this specific stretch, maybe, but this kind of land. She read it the way I read a ledger, fluently, without effort, seeing patterns and meanings that would be invisible to someone who hadn't spent a life in its language. Around noon, she tapped my shoulder. First contact, her hand on my shoulder, light, brief, there and gone, like a bird landing and leaving. I turned. She was pointing west, toward a low ridge I'd have dismissed as unremarkable. I looked where she pointed, saw nothing, looked again, still nothing. Then I saw what she saw and what I wouldn't have seen without her direction, maybe not in 100 crossings. A thin line of green at the ridge's base. Not obvious, not dramatic, just a faint thread of color in a landscape that had been bleached to uniformity. Water. Hidden water, seeping from rock, feeding a strip of vegetation too small to appear on any map, but large enough to water 2 mules and 2 people. I turned the wagon. We reached the seep in 20 minutes. It was everything she'd promised with that single pointed finger, a trickle of cold water running over flat stone, pooling in a natural basin the size of a wash basin, shaded by a single improbable mesquite that had no business being alive but was. I watered the mules. She drank from the basin, cupping her hands, and the water ran down her wrists and dripped from her elbows, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time I saw something on her face that wasn't fear or caution or that unnameable thing between fleeing and staying. Relief, just that, simple, enormous human relief. I wrote in my ledger, "Water found, not by me." And I sat there in the shade of that impossible mesquite, watching Roscoe drink and Alina drink and the girl drink. And I thought about all the crossings I'd made through the burn, sweating, rationing, counting miles to the next known water, and how there had been water here the whole time, right here, and I'd never seen it because I'd never known to look. I thought about what it means to know a land versus to cross it. I'd been crossing this country for years. She knew it. The difference was not small. She caught me watching her and looked away quickly, then, after a moment, looked back and did something I wasn't prepared for. She almost smiled. Not a full smile, not even half, a quarter maybe, an eighth. The smallest possible movement of the mouth that still qualifies as a smile, the way the smallest possible light at the end of a tunnel still qualifies as hope. It lasted less than a second. If I'd blinked, I'd have missed it entirely. But I didn't blink, and I didn't miss it, and I wrote nothing in my ledger about it because some things are too important for pencil and paper, and because I was beginning to understand that the most significant entries in any life are the ones that can't be. She was hiding in his wagon, terrified. The cowboy offered protection instead of questions. Part 2, the country between silence and speech. I have hauled cargo for 11 years. Salt, flour, dry goods, seed, tobacco, nails, bolts of cloth. One time a piano that nearly killed Alina on a switchback outside Marfa, and another time 3 crates of Bibles that the recipient refused to pay for because he said the word of God shouldn't come with a freight charge. I ate the cost on that one. Wrote it in my ledger as loss $7.40. Cause, theology. In all those years and all those miles, I had never hauled anything as complicated as the girl in my wagon bed. She did not speak, not that first day, not the second. I don't mean she was quiet in the way people are quiet when they've chosen not to talk. I mean she was quiet in the way the ground is quiet after an earthquake, not calm but held, compressed. As if every word she might have spoken was still inside her, stacked like cordwood, and the effort of keeping it stacked was taking everything she had. I didn't push. I made coffee. I made beans. I made the one thing I could make passably well, which was cornbread cooked in my cast-iron skillet directly on the coals, and which always came out burned on the bottom and raw in the center, but which filled the belly and gave the hands something warm to hold. She ate what I offered, always from the flat rock, always returning the spoon, always tucking the food into herself with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of someone who has learned that meals are not guaranteed, and therefore should not be wasted. On the second morning out from the hidden seep, April 16th by my count, though the days were beginning to blur at their edges, I was adjusting Alina's left trace chain when I heard a sound from the wagon that stopped me cold. She was humming, not a melody I recognized, not a melody at all, really, in the way I understood melodies, structured, repeating, headed somewhere. This was different. It moved the way water moves over uneven stone, finding its own path, doubling back, pooling, releasing. It was low, barely there. The kind of sound a person makes when they don't know they're making it, when the body decides to express something the mind hasn't approved. I stayed very still, kept my hands on Alina's trace chain, didn't turn around. Because I understood in some wordless place below my ribs that this sound was not for me. It was not for anyone. It was hers, and she was giving it to the air the way you give breath to the air, not as a gift but as a necessity, because keeping it inside had become harder than letting it out. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was different from the silence before. Fuller, lighter, as if something small had been released. I wrote in my ledger, music unplanned. The trail toward Fort Davis winds through a series of low canyons where the rock shifts from brown to red to a deep, bruised purple that looks almost alive in the late afternoon light. I've always liked this section. It's the only stretch of the route where the landscape offers something to the eye beyond repetition, and Roscoe tends to behave better in canyons, possibly because the walls limit his options for lateral mischief. We were in the third canyon, the one I privately call the elbow because it bends sharply east and then corrects itself, when she spoke for the first time. "Stop." One word, in English, clear, unaccented, surprising enough that I pulled the reins before I'd fully processed what I'd heard. Roscoe and Alina halted, equally surprised because I never stopped in the elbow. There was no water here, no shade worth claiming, and the canyon floor was too narrow to comfortably turn a wagon. I turned on the bench. She was standing in the wagon bed, one hand on the sideboard, looking up at the canyon wall to our left. Her face had changed. The fear was still there, it hadn't left. I was beginning to understand it might never fully leave, but layered over it was something urgent. Recognition. She pointed at the wall. I looked, saw rock. Red, striated, unremarkable. Looked longer the way she'd taught me to look at the burn, and slowly, like a picture emerging from fog, I saw what she was seeing. Drawings, painted onto the rock face, maybe 10 feet up, in pigments that had faded but not vanished, ochre and white, and a deep rust red that was almost the same color as the stone itself, which is why I'd missed them on every previous pass through this canyon. Figures, animals. Circles that might have been suns or moons or something else entirely. A line of human shapes, arms linked, forming a chain that stretched across a span of rock wider than my wagon. She climbed down from the wagon, walked to the base of the wall, stood there looking up, and her posture changed in a way I couldn't fully describe but could absolutely feel. She got taller. Not physically, she was still barely 5 feet, but in some other dimension that has nothing to do with inches. She stood the way a person stands in a place that belongs to them, or that they belong to, which is the same thing said from the other direction. She pressed her palm flat against the rock below the paintings where the stone was smooth and warm, closed her eyes. I stayed on the wagon bench. This was not my moment. I was a man who hauled salt through a canyon he'd never bothered to really see, and she was a woman standing in a place that held her history in its walls, and the distance between those two experiences was not one I could cross by climbing down from a bench. She stood there for a long time, 5 minutes, maybe 10, I didn't count. For once I didn't write anything down. The ledger sat closed on my knee, and my pencil stayed behind my ear, and I just watched, not studying her, not cataloging her, just witnessing her, the way you witness a sunrise or a storm, something that is happening, and that does not require your participation, only your attention. When she turned back to the wagon, her eyes were wet. Not crying, she wasn't crying, and I suspected she hadn't cried in a long time. That crying was a luxury that had been taken from her, or that she'd surrendered willingly. The way you surrender weight on a long march, dropping what you can't carry but wet. Bright, holding light. She climbed back in, settled between the grain sacks, and said quietly, looking not at me but at the painted wall receding behind us as I urged Roscoe forward. My grandmother's grandmother. 3 words, a lineage, a claim, a statement of belonging so compressed, so dense with meaning, that it contained more history than every book I'd ever failed to read. Her grandmother's grandmother had painted those figures, or had known the ones who did, or had stood beneath them the way she just stood, palm to stone, eyes closed, pulling something up from the rock through her skin and into whatever part of her still had room to hold it. I nodded, said nothing, picked up my pencil and wrote very small. Canyon wall, paintings, hers. 2 words too many, probably. But I was a man who needed to write things down, and she was becoming a person who deserved more than my pencil could offer. That evening I made camp at the canyon's eastern mouth, where the walls opened up and the sky returned in full. I built the fire larger than usual, not for warmth, though the canyon had held the day's heat and the night was mild, but because the dark felt different now. Less neutral, more watchful. She sat on her side of the fire. I sat on mine. The arrangement had become ritual by now, as fixed and necessary as any ceremony, the fire between us, the flat rock for the food, the returned spoon, the silence that was no longer empty but inhabited. I was writing in my ledger, April 16th, 12 miles, Roscoe bit a leaner twice, temperature mild, when she spoke again. Why, she said. I looked up. She was watching me across the fire, the flames putting movement into her face that her expression didn't carry. Still, waiting. Why what, I said, though I knew. I think I'd known since the first night that this question was coming. The way you know a storm is coming by the pressure change in your ears before the first cloud appears. Why did you not ask? I thought about that, set down my pencil, gave it the consideration it deserved because she had spent 3 days building toward this question, and a careless answer would be a kind of violence I wasn't willing to commit. I had a dog once, I said. Found him on the trail outside Sanderson. Half-starved, one ear torn, wouldn't come within 20 feet of me for 2 days. I left food out, kept my distance. On the 3rd day he came close enough to eat from the tin. On the 5th day he slept near the fire. Took 2 weeks before he'd let me touch him. I named him Farley. She waited. The fire cracked. Farley didn't need me to ask what had torn his ear, I said. He needed me to stop being one more thing that might tear the other one. Silence, long. The fire worked through a knot of mesquite and sent up a brief column of sparks that rose and vanished. Farley, she said, testing the word, finding it strange, maybe, or funny, or both. Where is Farley now? Died 3 years ago, snakebite. Rattler got him while he was sleeping under the wagon. I paused. I buried him outside Presidio, marked the spot with a cairn that's probably fallen over by now. You marked a dog's grave. I mark everything, it's a problem. Something shifted in her face. That almost smile from the hidden seep, but slightly larger this time. An 8th becoming a 6th. The tiniest expansion of something that wanted to grow but wasn't sure the soil was safe. My name, she said, is Nayland. She said it carefully, as if handing me something she'd considered not handing me, something she'd weighed and examined and debated, and the decision to offer it was bigger than the name itself. A name is a door. You give someone your name and you give them a way in, and she had spent days deciding whether I was someone she wanted inside. Nayland, I repeated, quietly, not claiming it. Just acknowledging receipt the way I'd acknowledge a delivery, confirming that the goods arrived, that they were handled gently, that they would be stored with care. It means, she started. You don't have to tell me what it means, I said. It means you. She looked at me for a long time, the fire between us, the mules shifting in the dark beyond, the stars, which were absurd in their abundance, as if the sky had been saving them for this particular evening and decided to deploy everything at once. My name is Ezra, I said. It doesn't mean anything. My mother liked the sound of it. Ezra, she said, and the way she said it, slowly, with a kind of deliberate attention, as if she were learning not just the word but the person attached to it, made me feel more seen than I had felt in years, which was uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. I wrote in my ledger, her name is Nayland, she knows mine. And below that, Farley would have liked her. The next morning brought the kind of weather that the territory produces when it wants to remind you that comfort is borrowed, never owned. The sky, which had been clear and generous for days, turned gray before dawn, and by the time I had the fire going, the wind was carrying a smell I recognized: rain. Not the gentle agricultural rain of places with green hills and regular seasons. Desert rain, the kind that doesn't negotiate. It arrives with all its force at once, as if it's been waiting for months and has lost patience with waiting. We should move, I said. Not to her specifically, not to the mules specifically, just to the morning air, which is how I've always communicated with the world, broadcasting, not targeting. She was already up, already gathering. She'd folded the sack she used as a blanket into a square so precise it looked military, and she'd set it in the wagon bed alongside the beaded pouch, which never left her reach. She moved with an efficiency I admired and could not match, every gesture purposeful, nothing wasted, as if she'd calculated the exact energy cost of each motion and eliminated every unnecessary calorie. I hitched the mules faster than usual, which Roscoe resented. He attempted to bite me, not a leaner for once, but me, and I dodged it with the automatic ease of long practice. Not now, I told him. He showed his teeth. I showed him the harness buckle. He relented. Our negotiations were simple and physical and entirely honest, which is more than I can say for most human negotiations I've witnessed. We made it 4 miles before the rain hit. It came from the south, which was wrong. Rain here usually comes from the west, and it came with a wind that bent the mesquite bushes sideways and made the wagon canvas snap like a sail. Within 2 minutes the trail was a river. Within 5, I couldn't see Roscoe's ears from the bench, and Roscoe's ears are not small. I pulled over. Not by choice, the mules stopped, and when both mules agree on something, the driver's opinion becomes decorative. I set the brake, lashed the reins, and climbed into the wagon bed, pulling the canvas tight behind me. She was there, already dry or drier than me, having had the sense to be under cover before the sky opened. She was pressed against the forward wall of the wagon bed, the grain sacks arranged around her in a configuration that was part shelter, part fortress, and entirely deliberate. The rain hammered the canvas. The wagon rocked. The world outside reduced itself to sound, water on cloth, water on ground, water on rock, the whole landscape becoming liquid. We sat on opposite sides of the wagon bed, close by necessity. The space was not large. The grain sacks and salt barrels took up most of it, and two humans, even two small ones, and she was small and I am not large, occupied the remainder with little room for the polite distances we'd maintained around the fire. Her knee was 8 inches from mine. I know because I measured it with my eyes, because measuring things is what I do when I don't know what else to do. "The rain," she said, "it will pass." "Usually does." "Not always." She was looking at the canvas above us, where the water pooled in the sagging center and dripped through a seam I'd been meaning to repair for 2 months. "Sometimes it stays. Sometimes the washes fill and the crossings close and the land says no. You've been caught before." Many times, a pause, but not alone. The weight of that last word settled between us like a third passenger. Not alone. She'd been caught in rain before, but with others, with her people. With family, community, the network of hands and voices that turns a storm from a threat into a shared experience. Now she was in a stranger's wagon with a leaking seam and 2 opinionated mules, and a man who communicated his feelings through a water-stained ledger. And whatever "not alone" had once meant to her, it meant something different now. "You're not alone now," I said. She looked at me. The rain drummed. A drop came through the seam and landed on my knee, cold and precise, and I didn't wipe it away because wiping it away would have required breaking the look she was giving me, and that look was worth a wet knee. "No," she said, "I am not." The rain lasted 3 hours. When it stopped the way it had started, completely, without transition, as if someone had turned a handle. The sky went from gray to blue in the time it took me to climb out of the wagon and check on the mules, who were standing in 6 inches of water with the weary dignity of creatures who have endured worse and expect to endure worse again. The trail was impassable. The wash I'd planned to cross, a normally dry channel that I'd crossed dozens of times without thought, was running bank to bank with brown water that carried branches, debris, and the general authority of a landscape reminding everything on it who was actually in charge. "We wait," I said. Naylin climbed out of the wagon and stood at the edge of the wash. She watched the water the way she'd watched the canyon paintings, with recognition, with respect, with a kind of intimate knowledge that I could observe but never share. She knew this water, not this specific wash maybe, but water like this. She knew its temper, its timeline, its habits. "Tomorrow," she said, "by afternoon." I trusted her. I want to note that, because trust is a thing I ration carefully. I trust Roscoe to bite and Alina to shy and my ledger to hold its numbers and the sun to rise in the east. And beyond those few certainties, I keep my trust account lean. But when Naylin said the wash would clear by tomorrow afternoon, I didn't question it. I didn't check the sky for confirmation. I didn't calculate flow rates or estimate volume, or do any of the numerical things I usually do when faced with uncertainty. I just believed her, and the ease of that believing surprised me so deeply that I had to sit down on the wagon tongue and catch my breath, because believing another person without evidence is a kind of falling, and I hadn't fallen in so long I'd forgotten what the air felt like on the way down. I set up camp right there at the wash's edge, built a fire with wet wood that smoked more than it burned but eventually committed, made coffee, made cornbread, set out the flat rock, the spoon, the cup. She sat on her side, but closer than before. The fire was between us, as always, but the fire was smaller, the wet wood wouldn't support ambition, and so the distance between her side and mine had shrunk. Not dramatically, not enough for any observer to note, but I noted it because I note everything, and because the distance between two people is a number I was learning to track with more care than miles or dollars. "I will tell you," she said without preamble, without looking at me, looking instead at the swollen wash and the brown water and the sky that was now so aggressively clear it felt apologetic. "What happened, if you want to hear?" I set down my pencil, closed the ledger, folded my hands over it. "Only if you want to tell it," I said, "and you can stop whenever you want. And I won't write it down." That last part cost me. Writing things down is how I survive. It's my rope, my anchor, my way of tying myself to the world when the world feels too large and too fast. Promising not to write something down was like promising not to breathe, possible, briefly, but against my nature. But she needed to know that her story would live in me, not in my ledger. That it would be held in the imperfect, unindexed, uncategorizable place where humans keep things that matter too much for paper. She looked at me, nodded, accepted the terms. And then she began. "There was a camp," she said. 3 days walk south. My mother, my sisters, my aunt, others, we were not hiding. We were living. There is a difference, but the soldiers did not see it." She paused. The fire smoked. I did not reach for my pencil. "They came at dawn. They always come at dawn. It is their favorite hour. They think we are sleeping, and sometimes we are, but my mother never slept past the first bird. She heard them before they reached the outer edge. She woke us. She said one word." Nayland stopped, swallowed, looked at the wash. "Run," she said. The word was run. The fire popped. A log shifted and sent up a spiral of sparks and smoke. Roscoe, somewhere behind us in the dark, sneezed. "I ran," she said. "We all ran, different directions, the way we practiced. My mother and my youngest sister went north. My aunt and her children went east. I went west. Alone, that was the plan. Scatter, regroup at the place we all knew. But the soldiers, there were more of them than we expected. They followed every direction. They were on horses, I was on foot." Her voice had changed. Not louder, not faster, but denser. Each word carrying more weight, as if the air itself was thickening around them. "I ran for 2 days. I found your wagon at a supply post. You were inside the building. The mules were hitched. The wagon was open. I climbed in. I buried myself between the grain sacks and I." She stopped. "I waited to die," she said. "I expected you to find me, and I expected to die. That is what I expected. That is what experience had taught me to expect." The wash roared, the fire smoked. I said nothing because there was nothing to say, because "I'm sorry" was too small, and "that shouldn't have happened" was too obvious, and everything else was just noise, and she deserved better than noise. "But you said easy," she said. "Like I was a horse, like I was a mule." It was the right thing to say. She looked at me now, directly, fully, with both eyes and whatever was behind them. "No one had spoken to me gently in 11 days. Your voice said easy, and my body heard safe. And they are not the same word, but they were the same." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The word she was reaching for, meaning, maybe, or feeling, or frequency, existed in the space between us. Unspoken, understood. The way the best and most important things always exist. Not as words, but as the warmth words leave behind when they've done their imperfect work and stepped aside. I sat with her story. Let it settle into me. Let it find the places in my chest where stories go when they're too heavy for the head. The deep, subterranean chambers that don't appear in any anatomy book, but that everyone knows are there. Because everyone has stood at the edge of another person's pain and felt the ground inside themselves rearranged to make room. "What happened to your mother?" I asked. Not because I needed to know, because she needed to say. "I don't know," 2 words. The heaviest I'd heard her speak. "I don't know what happened to any of them. The place we were supposed to regroup, I went there. I waited 2 days. No one came, so I walked. I walked until I found your wagon. And here I am, sitting by a swollen wash with a man who talks to his mules and marks dog graves with." She stopped again, but this time the stopping wasn't grief, it was something else. The corner of her mouth moved, that eighth of a smile growing, a sixth, a fifth, almost impossibly a quarter. "With cairns," she finished, "in Presidio." "The cairn was well built," I said. "I am sure it was." We looked at each other across the shrinking fire, and something happened that I still can't describe in language I trust. A rearrangement, a recalibration, a moment in which 2 people who had been strangers sharing space became something else. Something without a word. Something that existed only in the specific combination of her story and my silence, her pain and my cornbread, her grandmother's paintings and my water stained. She was hiding in his wagon, terrified. The cowboy offered protection instead of questions. Part 3, the crossing at Fort Davis. The wash cleared at 2:15 in the afternoon, exactly when Nayland said it would. I know the time because I checked my pocket watch. A brass Hamilton that lost 4 minutes every week and that I corrected every Sunday, not because accuracy mattered on the trail, but because the ritual of correction soothed me. 4 minutes. Every Sunday. Predictable, fixable, unlike everything else. The water receded with the same lack of ceremony it had arrived with. 1 hour it was a churning brown authority. The next it was a damp channel with a few stubborn puddles and a scattering of debris, branches, stones. A child's leather shoe that had washed from somewhere upstream and that I stared at longer than I should have before looking away. Nayland saw the shoe too. I know because her hand went to the beaded pouch at her chest, the way it always did when something landed too close. She held it for a moment, then released it, then climbed into the wagon bed without comment. I didn't write about the shoe. Some things refused to be numbers. I was learning this slowly, the way I learn everything, through repetition, error, and the eventual grudging admission that my system has gaps. We crossed. Roscoe went first, testing the footing with the exaggerated caution of a mule who has been personally offended by mud before and intends never to be offended again. Eleanor followed. The wagon lurched, caught, settled, and rolled forward. I exhaled. On the other side, the trail climbed out of the wash channel and into open country again, and the air changed. That particular shift that happens when the ground rises and the horizon drops, and suddenly you can see in every direction, which should feel like freedom but sometimes feels like exposure, depending on what's looking back. Fort Davis was a day and a half away. I could see, very faintly, the dark shape of the Davis Mountains on the horizon, not the mountains themselves, but their suggestion. The way the sky changed color where they began, blue becoming blue-gray, becoming the soft purple of distance. Nayland saw them too. She was sitting upright in the wagon bed now, not between the grain sacks, but beside them, her back against the sideboard, her face turned toward the mountains. Torn dress had been further repaired. She'd used a thin strip of canvas that I recognized as coming from the wagon's splash guard, which I hadn't noticed missing until now, which meant she'd taken it carefully, skillfully, while I slept or while I was occupied with the mules. I wasn't bothered by this. If anything, it pleased me. She was using what was available, taking only what she needed, modifying the material with a precision that turned scrap into clothing. The splash guard would need replacing. She needed a shoulder that didn't show its wound. The math was simple. Fort Davis, I said, half to her, half to the mules. Tomorrow evening if we keep pace, morning after if Roscoe finds something to object to. Roscoe's ears rotated backward. He had heard his name and was considering his options. Nayland said nothing for a long time. Then, what is at Fort Davis? Ranch Pendleton's place. He's expecting the grain and some of the salt. I'll resupply, rest the mules, and turn back for Carrizo Springs. And me. 2 words, the most direct she had been. Not aggressive. Nayland did not do aggressive. She did precise, but aimed. She wanted to know where she fit in the itinerary. She wanted to know if she was cargo or company, and whether the destination that applied to the grain applied to her. I'd been thinking about this. Not productively. My thinking on matters that don't involve weight, distance, or money tends to circle rather than advance, but persistently, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. What happens at Fort Davis? What happens to a young Apache woman in a territory that has decided, with the calm administrative cruelty that territories specialize in, that her people are problems to be managed, moved, or eliminated? I knew what Fort Davis was, a town growing around a military post. Soldiers, settlers, people who used words like Indian problem and pacification and reservation with the same casual comfort they used words like weather and breakfast. People who would look at Nayland and see a category, not a person. An abstraction, not a name. You don't have to come into town, I said. I can make the delivery, resupply, and meet you outside. There's a place I camp about 3 miles south of Pendleton's gate. Water, cover. You'd be comfortable. Comfortable, she repeated, tasting the word, finding it inadequate maybe or ironic. You want me to hide. I want you to be safe. Those are the same thing. They shouldn't be. She looked at me. The fire wasn't between us. It was mid-afternoon, no fire, just the open wagon and the open air and the 2 of us in a conversation that had nowhere to hide either. No flames to filter the expressions, no smoke to blur the edges. Just her face and mine, 30 inches apart in unforgiving daylight. No, she said, they should not. We camped that evening at a place I'd used before, a a shallow depression ringed by juniper that smelled like gin and cedar and offered decent wind protection. I built the fire. She gathered the juniper berries. I hadn't known they were edible, or if I'd known, I'd forgotten, or if I'd remembered, I'd never tested the knowledge, and crushed them between two stones and added them to the beans. The beans were better, measurably better. The juniper gave them a sharpness that cut through the heaviness, the way a high note cuts through a chord, lifting everything around it. I ate 2 portions. She watched me eat the second portion with that almost smile, now approaching a reliable third, a third of a smile, showing up regularly, like a tenant who's decided to stay but hasn't signed the lease. "You can cook," I said. "Everyone can cook." "That is categorically untrue. My cornbread is evidence." "Your cornbread is evidence of persistence." "Not skill." "Fair." We sat, the juniper crackled. The mules stood in the shelter of the trees, hip-shot and drowsy, Roscoe's head drooping in the boneless way that meant he was genuinely asleep, and not just waiting for a leaner to lower her guard. "I want to tell you about the pouch," she said. I looked at her. She was holding it in both hands, the way she always held it, centered on her chest, fingers curled around it, the beadwork catching firelight in patterns I'd glimpsed but never studied, because studying it felt like reading someone's letter over their shoulder. "You don't have to." "I know I want to." She opened it, reached inside, drew out 3 items, which she placed on the ground between us, not on the flat rock, not in the neutral territory of our food exchange, but on the bare earth, in the space that belonged to neither of us and therefore could belong to what she was about to share. A braid of hair dark, tied with red thread. A stone, flat and oval, with a marking on one side that looked like it had been etched with a fine tool. A circle with 4 lines radiating outward. A small piece of rawhide, folded, with something drawn on it in faded pigment. I couldn't see the drawing from where I sat, and I didn't lean forward to look. "My mother's hair," she said, touching the braid. "Cut the day before my naming ceremony when I was given my name. She braided it and kept it until I was old enough to carry it myself." She touched the stone. "From the mountain where my grandmother lived, the mark is her clan sign. Everywhere she walked, she carried this stone so the mountain would know she had not forgotten it." She touched the rawhide. "My sister drew this for me. She was 9. It is a horse." She paused. "It does not look like a horse. She was not skilled with drawing, but she made it for me and told me it was a horse, and so it is a horse." She looked up at me. Her eyes were full, and this time I think she might have been close to crying, closer than I'd seen, but the tears didn't fall. They held, like the wash before it broke, like the sky before the rain. "This is everything," she said. "This is what I ran with. I left food. I left a blanket. I left tools. I kept this." I understood, not in the way you understand a sentence or a sum. In the other way. The way you understand a thunderclap, not by analyzing it, but by having it move through you and rearrange things you didn't know could be rearranged. She had run with identity. She had dropped survival and kept self. Because survival without self is just breathing, and breathing without knowing who you are is just mechanics, and she was not a mechanical person. She was Naylin. She was her mother's braid and her grandmother's stone and her sister's terrible horse, and she had chosen those things over food and warmth because those things were the difference between being alive and being her. "It's a good horse," I said. Because the rawhide had shifted in the firelight, and I could see the drawing now, 4 legs at impossible angles. A body shaped more like a bean than a barrel, a head that might have been a head or might have been a second tail. And it was, by any objective measure, not a good horse. But it was the horse her 9-year-old sister had drawn for her, and that made it the best horse in every territory and every canyon and every burning flat stretch of this whole indifferent land. Naylin laughed. Not the almost smile, not the quarter expression. A laugh, short, surprised, slightly hoarse, as if the machinery hadn't been used in weeks and needed oiling. But a laugh. The sound of it hit the juniper and bounced back, and for a moment the camp felt populated, not with people but with the memory of people, her mother, her grandmother, her sister, all of them present in the echo of a single startled sound. "It is a terrible horse," she said. "The worst horse I've ever seen." My sister insisted the legs were correct. "Your sister was a bold artist." "She is," present tense. Not was. She caught it, the tense, the hope it carried, the weight of choosing, is over, was, when you don't know which is true. She caught it and held it and didn't correct it, and I didn't correct it either, because grammar is not more important than hope, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never waited by a swollen wash for someone who might not come. She put the items back in the pouch, closed it, returned it to her chest. I didn't write anything in the ledger that night, not because I'd promised not to, but because the evening had been so perfectly and completely itself that any record I made would be smaller than what happened, and I was tired of making things smaller. Fort Davis appeared the next afternoon like something reluctant, buildings emerging from the landscape not with pride but with apology, as if they knew they didn't belong here and were doing their best to be unobtrusive about it. The town was small. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, 3 houses that looked permanent, 8 that looked temporary, and Pendleton's ranch spread across the valley beyond. Its fences the only straight lines in a landscape that had never heard of straight. I stopped the wagon 3 miles south, at my usual spot. Cottonwoods again, this land repeats its kindnesses in specific forms, and a creek that was running high from yesterday's rain. "I'll go in alone," I said. "Make the delivery, resupply, be back before dark." Nayland climbed out of the wagon. She looked toward town, toward the buildings and fences and the faint sound of hammering that carried on the wind. Her face was unreadable. Not blank, never blank. Her face always held something, but layered the way the canyon walls had been layered, meaning on top of meaning, readable only to someone who knew the language. "There is a thing I have not told you," she said. "I waited. When I ran from the camp, when my mother said the word, I was not only running from soldiers, I was running towards something. My mother told me to find the people at Ojo Calient, the springs. She said there were people there, our people. She said if we were scattered, if the regrouping place failed, to go north and find them. Ojo Calient, I knew the name. Hot springs north of here across hard country, a gathering place. Not a place on my maps, but maps are written by the people who draw lines, not by the people who live between them." "That's north," I said, "past the Davis Mountains, 4 or 5 days through open country." "I know. On foot without supplies, through territory that." "I know." I stopped, because the sentence I was building, the one about danger, about distance, about the practical impossibilities of a lone woman crossing that much hostile land, was a sentence built from my ledger brain, my numbers brain, the brain that calculates risk and weight and cost. And she wasn't asking for calculation. She was telling me where she was going. She was telling me her direction, the way the compass tells you north, not as an invitation to debate, but as a fact. "I can take you part way," I said. "After the delivery, I can go north before I turn back to Carrizo Springs. Pendleton won't care. He only cares about the grain." "You would change your route." "I change my route for water. I change my route for weather. I changed my route for a hidden seep you showed me in the burn." I looked at her. "Routes are suggestions, Nayland, not commandments." She considered this, turned it over the way she turned over every piece of information I gave her carefully from multiple angles, checking for cracks. "How far could you take me?" 2 days north, maybe 3, past the mountains into the basin country. After that, I'd need to turn back or the mules would starve. 2 days would help. Then 2 days. She nodded. That nod, economical, total, the nod of a person who has made a decision and filed it in the place where decisions go, carried more gratitude than any spoken thank you I'd ever received. Not because she was ungrateful, because gratitude, for Nayland, lived in action, not in words. She would accept the 2 days not with speeches, but with the quiet, structural dignity of a person who knows what a gift costs and intends to honor that cost by using it well. I made the delivery. Pendleton was Pendleton, red-faced, loud, the kind of man who tests every sack of grain as if he suspects you filled it with sand, and who complains about the price as if you said it personally, and who pays you the agreed amount in the end because, for all his noise, he is fundamentally fair. I resupplied. Coffee, beans, flour, a new canvas splash guard that I did not, strictly speaking, need. Salt pork, dried apples, a tin of peaches that cost more than it should have, but that seemed, in the moment, important. I also bought a pair of boots, women's, small. The selection at the general store was limited, 2 pairs, one too large, one approximately right. I chose the approximately right ones. They were plain. Brown leather, low heel, functional. They were not beautiful. They were not meant to be beautiful. They were meant to keep the ground from punishing bare feet, and they would do that job without complaint. I put them in the wagon bed beside the grain sacks, which were now replaced with fresh supplies. I didn't place them on the flat rock. I didn't present them. I just put them where she would find them, the way I'd put the coffee and the beans and everything else, available, not imposed. When I got back to the cottonwoods, she was sitting by the creek, her feet in the water, the beaded pouch on the bank beside her. She looked up when I arrived, looked past me at the wagon, saw the boots. She didn't say anything for a long time. She walked to the wagon, picked them up, held them the way she'd held the tin cup that first night, fast, committed, braced. She turned them over, examined the soles, tested the leather with her thumb. She put them on. They fit, not perfectly, approximately the way I'd estimated, but well enough. She stood in them, took a step, took another, walked to the creek and back. The boots changed her walk. Not dramatically, but the hesitation was gone, the careful, testing footfall of bare skin on uncertain ground. She walked with the full, committed stride of a person who trusts the surface beneath her, and watching that transformation, from careful to confident, from testing to trusting, was worth more than the boots cost, which was $2.40, which I did write in my ledger because the ledger needed something and the boots were a fact I could give it. She looked at me, the smile no longer an eighth or a sixth or a quarter, a full half, generous by her standards, enormous. "They are ugly boots," she said. "They are very ugly boots. I have never owned anything so ugly." "You're welcome." And there it was again, the laugh, louder this time, stronger, 2 syllables instead of 1. A laugh that had been waiting for permission, and finding the permission in a pair of ugly boots was exactly the kind of illogical, human, unlegible thing that this whole journey had been teaching me to expect. We left the next morning heading north, away from my route, away from my schedule, away from every number in my ledger that described where I was supposed to be and when. Elinor seemed pleased by the new direction. Roscoe was suspicious, which was his default state regarding all decisions not made by Roscoe. The country north of Fort Davis opens up in a way that feels personal, as if the land is deciding, mile by mile, to trust you with more of itself. The mountains fall away. The basins widen. The sky gets larger, which shouldn't be possible because the sky is the sky, but out here it grows, it expands. It takes up space that the mountains were hoarding, and suddenly you're small in a way that isn't frightening but clarifying. You're a dot. A speck. A man on a wagon with 2 mules and a woman in ugly boots, moving north through a country that was old before your grandparents' grandparents were born. Nayland sat beside me on the bench. First time. Not in the wagon bed, not between the grain sacks, but beside me on the bench, her feet booted, ugly, functional, resting on the footboard, her eyes on the horizon, her hands in her lap instead of on the pouch. The pouch was still there, still at her chest, but her hands were free. And free hands mean something different than clutching hands, something I felt more than understood. We talked, not constantly, Nayland did not do constantly, but in stretches the way the land came in stretches, open spaces followed by narrow passages followed by open spaces again. She told me about the camp, not the raid. She'd told that story, and it was told, but the life before the raid. The way her mother made stew with wild onions and venison and a specific type of root that grew near water and that tasted, she said, like the earth trying to apologize for being so hard to live on. The way her sister sang while she worked, not the quiet humming Nayland had done in the wagon, but full, unashamed singing that filled the camp and annoyed the dogs and made everyone, even the elders, smile despite themselves. The way her grandmother had walked 12 miles every spring to visit the canyon paintings and had taken Nayland with her. Once, when Nayland was small enough to ride on her grandmother's back, and had stood beneath the figures and told her who they were and who she was, and how those 2 things were connected by a thread that distance and time and soldiers could stretch but never cut. I listened, didn't write. Let the stories enter me through my ears and settle in the uncatalogued spaces where the most important things live, below the ledger, below the numbers, in the country between what can be measured and what matters. She asked about me, too. Not many questions. Nayland was precise with questions the way she was precise with everything, but the ones she asked were exact. Where was I from? Why did I haul freight? Did I have family? Did I want family? I answered, told her about the farm in Missouri that wasn't mine anymore because the bank said so. The wife who'd left before the farm did, taking the possibility of family with her in a carpetbag and a 4-word note. I deserve more. Sorry. I didn't blame her. I told Nayland that. I didn't blame her because the farm was failing and I was failing with it. And more was a reasonable thing to deserve, even if the wanting of it left a hole in a specific shape that nothing since had filled. You fill holes with numbers, Nayland said. Yes. Numbers are patient. They wait for you to need them. Yes. People are not patient. No. She looked at me, the half-smile. You are patient. I'm slow. People confuse the two. I do not confuse them. The second day north, we reached the edge of the basin country. The land flattened into a vast, pale expanse dotted with creosote and greasewood, and in the distance, north, always north, I could see the faint shimmer that might have been heat haze or might have been water, the land refusing to commit to a single truth. This is where I turn back, I said. Not because I wanted to. Because the mules needed water I couldn't guarantee beyond this point, and because promises made to mules are as binding as promises made to people, or should be. Nayland nodded. She'd known this was coming. She'd been preparing for it, I think, in the quiet way she prepared for everything, internally, structurally, without fuss. She climbed down from the bench, stood on the ground in her ugly boots, looked north, looked back at me. I handed her a sack I'd prepared the night before while she slept. Dried apples, salt pork, the tin of peaches, a canteen, a folding knife. Not enough for the full journey. Enough for 2, maybe 3 days. After that, she'd rely on the land, which she knew better than I knew my ledger, so the math, for once, was in her favor. She took the sack, held it the way she held things, fast, committed, braced. Ezra, she said. Nayland. The cairn in Presidio, for Farley. Yes. Build me one. I didn't understand immediately. Then I did. Not a grave marker, a place marker. A point on the landscape that said she was here. She existed. She passed through this man's life and left a shape in it that the wind hasn't filled and won't fill because some shapes are deeper than wind. Where, I asked. Here, where you turn back. So if I ever come south again, I will know where you stopped caring about your mules long enough to go the wrong direction for a stranger. You're not a stranger. No, I am not. She reached into the beaded pouch, drew out the flat stone, her grandmother's stone, the clan mark, the mountain carried in a palm. She held it out to me. I can't take this, I said. This is yours. The mountain is mine. The stone is a piece of it. I am giving you a piece, not the whole. She pressed it into my hand. Mark the cairn with it, so the mountain knows I was here too. I held the stone. It was warm from her body, smooth from generations of hands. The mark on its surface, the circle, the 4 lines, was worn but visible. The way old truths are worn but visible. The way a canyon painting fades but doesn't vanish. The way a mother's single word, run, echoes long after the voice has been swallowed by distance. She turned, walked north. Ugly boots on hard ground, sack over one shoulder, beaded pouch at her chest, back straight, stride sure. I watched her until she was small, then smaller, then just a shape, then just a suggestion of a shape, then just the idea of a shape held in place by attention alone. Then she was gone, and the basin was empty, and Roscoe bit a leaner, and the world which had paused resumed. I built the cairn. 7 stones, stacked with the obsessive care of a man who needs to get at least one thing right today. I placed her grandmother's stone at the top, the mark facing north, facing the direction she'd gone, facing the springs and the people and the life she was walking toward with nothing but a sack of dried apples and a pair of boots ugly enough to scare a mule.